The old wooden floor of Murphy's saloon creaked under the weight of dozens of boots as men pushed closer to get a better look. Smoke from cheap cigars hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. In the corner, a piano player hammered out a cheerful tune that felt completely wrong for what was happening. 3 young women stood on what used to be a card table, now serving as a makeshift stage. The oldest one, about 19, had her arms wrapped protectively around her 2 younger sisters. Her name was Rose, and her dark hair had come loose from its braid, falling around her face like a curtain she wished could hide her completely. Next, to her stood Lily, 17 years old with the same dark eyes as her sister but a fire burning in them that wouldn't go out. She kept her chin up high, glaring at every man who dared to look at her with hungry eyes. Her hands were clenched into fists, and more than once she had to stop herself from swinging at someone who got too close. The youngest was Daisy, barely 14, with tears streaming down her round cheeks. She pressed her face against Rose's shoulder, trying to disappear into her sister's worn cotton dress. Her whole body shook like a leaf in a storm, and she kept whispering prayers their mother had taught them years ago. All 3 girls wore their Sunday best, but even their nicest dresses looked shabby now. Rose's blue dress had a torn sleeve from when one of the men had grabbed her earlier. Lily's green dress was stained with mud from the journey to town. Little Daisy's yellow dress, which had once been Rose's, hung loose on her small frame. The saloon owner, a big man everyone called Murphy, stood next to the girls with a wide grin on his red face. His belly hung over his belt, and his shirt had more stains than a painter's apron. He kept wiping his sweaty forehead with a dirty handkerchief while he shouted over the noise of the crowd. "Come on now, gentlemen," Murphy called out, his voice booming across the room. "You won't find prettier girls than these anywhere in the territory. They can cook, clean, and the oldest one here can even read and write. That's worth something, ain't it?" The crowd of men pressed closer, their voices getting louder with each drink they took. Some were settlers who had been alone on their claims for months, hungry for company. Others were drifters and gamblers who saw the girls as nothing more than a good time. A few were miners, their clothes still dirty from the gold fields, with more money than sense burning holes in their pockets. "I'll give you $50 for the little one," shouted a man with a gray beard and missing teeth. He waved a bottle of whiskey in the air, spilling half of it on the floor. "75 for the middle one," called another voice from the back of the room. Rose felt her heart sink with every shout, every bid that treated them like cattle at market. She remembered just 3 months ago when their father was still alive, when they had their own little farm outside of town. It wasn't much, just a small cabin and a few acres, but it was theirs. They grew vegetables and kept chickens, and their father worked odd jobs in town to make ends meet. Then the fever came. It started with their father feeling tired after work. Then the chills set in. Rose did everything she could, using every home remedy their mother had taught her before she died giving birth to Daisy. But nothing worked. Their father got weaker and weaker until one morning he just didn't wake up. That's when Murphy showed up at their door with papers saying their father owed him money. Rose couldn't read all the fancy words, but she understood enough to know they were in trouble. Murphy claimed their father had borrowed against the farm to pay for medicine and food when times got tough. Now he wanted his money back, and when they couldn't pay, he took everything. "Don't worry," Murphy had said with that same greasy smile he wore now. "I'll take care of you girls. You'll work for me until the debt is paid off." But Rose quickly learned that working for Murphy meant being locked in a back room of the saloon, bringing drinks to customers and dodging their grabbing hands. It meant listening to Murphy talk about how much money he could make if he sold them to men looking for wives. It meant watching her little sister cry herself to sleep every night on a pile of old blankets. $100 for all 3, someone yelled, and the room exploded with laughter. "Come now, that ain't nearly enough," Murphy said, still grinning. "These are quality girls from a good family. Their pa was an honest man, God rest his soul, so..." Wanted to scream. If their father was such a good man, why was Murphy doing this to his daughters? But she bit her tongue and held her sisters tighter. She had learned that fighting back only made things worse. A man in a fancy suit pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His mustache was waxed to sharp points, and he carried a gold pocket watch that caught the lamplight. "I'll pay 200 for the oldest one," he said in a smooth voice that made Rose's skin crawl. "She'll make a fine addition to my establishment in the next town over." Rose knew what kind of establishment he meant, and her blood ran cold. She had heard whispers about places where women disappeared and were never seen again. She pulled Daisy closer and felt Lily's hand squeeze hers. The crowd was getting more excited now, sensing that the real bidding was about to begin. Men pushed and shoved to get closer, waving money and bottles in the air. The piano player had given up trying to play over the noise and was now just watching the show with the rest of them. Murphy's eyes lit up like stars at the mention of $200. That was more money than most people in this town saw in a year. "Now we're talking sense," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Do I hear 250? 250, called out a voice from somewhere in the back. 300, shouted another. Rose felt dizzy as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Each bid felt like a nail in their coffin, sealing their fate. She looked around the room desperately, hoping to see a friendly face, someone who might help them, but all she saw were hungry eyes and cruel smiles. The saloon doors were blocked by the crowd, and even if they could somehow fight their way through, where would they go? They had no money, no family, no friends who could help them. Murphy had made sure everyone in town knew about their father's debt and how he was just trying to collect what was owed to him. $400. The fancy man's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "And that's my final offer." The room went quiet for a moment as everyone looked around to see if anyone would bid higher. Rose could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Daisy's sobs had turned into hiccups and Lily's hand was shaking in hers. Murphy looked like he was about to speak, probably to accept the bid and seal their fate forever. His mouth opened and Rose closed her eyes, not wanting to see the moment. When their lives changed forever, that's when they heard it. The sound of splintering wood as the saloon doors burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. A cold wind rushed in, making the oil lamps flicker and dance, casting wild shadows on the walls. The entire room turned to see what had caused such a commotion. Even Murphy stopped talking, his mouth hanging open like a fish. Rose opened her eyes and looked toward the doorway, her heart still racing, but now with a tiny spark of hope. Someone had come. Someone had actually come. The broken pieces of the saloon door scattered across the floor like wooden confetti. Everyone in Murphy's saloon turned to stare at the figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dusty street outside. The cold evening air rushed in, making the oil lamps flicker and sending papers flying off tables. A tall man stepped through the ruined entrance, his boots crunching on the splintered wood. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but something about the way he carried himself made everyone take notice. His clothes were simple but well made: dark pants, a white shirt rolled up to his elbows, and a black hat that had seen better days. Dust covered his shoulders and boots like he'd ridden hard to get here. The stranger's eyes swept across the crowded room, taking in every detail. His face was weathered from years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. A neat beard covered his jaw, and his brown hair showed the first touches of gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that made people step back, steel blue and sharp as winter ice. Rose felt her breath catch in her throat as those eyes found hers across the room. For just a moment she saw something there that she hadn't seen in months. Kindness. Real, honest kindness that made her want to cry with relief. The man's name was Thomas Sullivan, though most folks just called him Tom. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, a spread of land so big it took a full day to ride across it. He'd built it up from nothing over the past 15 years, working from dawn to dusk to turn wild grassland into prime cattle country. Tom had been in town buying supplies when he heard the commotion coming from Murphy's saloon. At first, he'd planned to mind his own business. He had enough troubles running his ranch without getting mixed up in whatever foolishness was happening at the local watering hole. But then he heard Murphy's voice booming about an auction, and something made him stop and listen. When he realized what was really going on, what kind of auction Murphy was running, Tom felt a rage build in his chest like a fire catching dry, kindling. He'd seen a lot of bad things in his time on the frontier, but selling young women like livestock crossed a line that no decent man should ever cross. Now he stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. The crowd of men who had been shouting and bidding just moments before now shuffled their feet and avoided his gaze. Everyone in the territory knew Tom Sullivan's reputation. He was fair in his dealings, generous to those in need, but absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting the innocent. Murphy was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than his usual boom. "Now, Tom, this here's a private matter. No need for you to concern yourself with private." Tom's voice cut through Murphy's words like a blade through paper. He took another step into the saloon, and several men moved out of his way. "Seems pretty public to me, Murphy. Half the town can hear you from the street." The fancy man with the waxed mustache stepped forward, his gold pocket watch glinting in the lamplight. "See here, my good man. I've made a fair offer for these young ladies. This is simply business." Tom turned those ice-blue eyes on the stranger, and the man actually took a step backward. "Business?" Tom repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "What kind of business are you in, mister?" The fancy man's face went pale, and he suddenly seemed very interested in studying his expensive boots. He mumbled something about having urgent matters to attend to and pushed his way toward the back of the crowd. Murphy tried to regain control of the situation, puffing out his chest like a rooster. "Now see here, Tom Sullivan. These girls owe me money. Their pa borrowed against their property, and now I'm just trying to collect what's rightfully mine. Is that so?" Tom reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. The soft clink of coins inside made everyone in the room perk up their ears. "Well then, Murphy, I reckon we can settle this debt right here and now." He walked slowly toward the bar, his spurs jingling with each step. The crowd parted before him like water, no one wanting to get in his way. When he reached the bar, he opened the pouch and began counting out gold coins, each one making a solid ring as it hit the wooden surface. 100, Tom said, placing the first coin down with deliberate care. 200, 300, 400. He paused and looked up at Murphy. "That should cover the highest bid I heard, plus interest." Murphy's eyes were fixed on the growing pile of gold like a cat watching a mouse. His tongue darted out to lick his lips, and Rose could practically see him calculating the money in his head. $400 was more than his saloon made in 6 months. 500, Tom continued, adding another coin to the pile. 600, 700. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man present. 800, 900, $1,000. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. $1,000 was a fortune, more money than most of these men would see in their entire lives. Murphy was practically drooling as he stared at the golden pile. "There," Tom said, straightening up and brushing his hands off. "I believe that more than covers any debt these young ladies might owe you, Murphy, with enough left over to fix your door." But Rose felt her heart sink even as she watched this stranger put down all that money. She'd heard men make deals like this before, and she knew that whoever paid the most expected to get what they'd bought. Was this Tom Sullivan any different from the others, or was he just another man with money who thought he could buy people? Tom must have seen the fear in her eyes because he took off his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, nothing like the hard tone he'd used with Murphy and the other men. "Miss," he said, looking directly at Rose, "I know you don't know me from Adam, and I know you got every reason to be scared. But I want you to understand something real clear." He paused, making sure she was listening. "This money don't buy you or your sisters. It just pays off whatever debt Murphy claims you owe him." Rose blinked in surprise. That wasn't what she'd expected to hear at all. Tom continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon. "What happens next is entirely up to you and your sisters. You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you think is best. If you need a place to stay while you figure things out, my ranch has plenty of room. But that's an offer of help, not an order." Lily squeezed Rose's hand, and even little Daisy looked up from her sister's shoulder to stare at this strange man who talked about freedom instead of ownership. Murphy sputtered and protested, clearly not happy about losing his valuable auction items. But the pile of gold coins spoke louder than his complaints. Several of the other men in the crowd began slinking toward the door, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere now that their entertainment was over. Tom put his hat back on and extended his hand toward the makeshift stage. "What do you say, ladies? Would you like to get out of here?" Rose looked at her sisters, seeing hope flickering in their eyes for the first time in months. Maybe, just maybe, their luck was finally starting to change. She took a deep breath and reached out to take Tom Sullivan's offered hand. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady as bedrock. "We surely would." Rose's hand trembled as she reached out to take Tom Sullivan's offered help. His fingers were rough and calloused from years of ranch work, but his grip was gentle as he helped her down from the makeshift stage. Lily followed next, her chin still, held high with defiance, though Rose could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Little Daisy clung to Rose's skirt, peeking out at Tom like a frightened rabbit. The three sisters stood together in the smoky saloon, suddenly feeling very small and lost. Around them, the crowd of men began to drift away, disappointed that their evening's entertainment had come to such an abrupt end. Some grumbled under their breath about Tom Sullivan ruining their fun, but none dared say it loud enough for him to hear. Murphy swept the gold coins into his apron with greedy hands, counting and recounting them as if they might disappear if he looked away. "Well then," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes, "I suppose that settles our business." Tom's jaw tightened as he watched Murphy pocket the money. "It better be settled, Murphy. These ladies don't owe you another cent, and I don't want to hear about you bothering them again." The saloon owner nodded quickly, suddenly very interested in wiping down glasses that were already clean. Tom turned his attention back to the sisters, his expression softening when he saw how scared they still looked. "Ladies," he said quietly, "why don't we step outside where we can talk proper? This ain't the place for a conversation." Rose nodded, though her legs felt weak as water. She dreamed of getting out of Murphy's saloon for weeks, but now that it was actually happening, she didn't know what to think. Was this Tom Sullivan really as good as he seemed? Or was this just a different kind of trap? The cool evening air felt like heaven after the stuffy, smoke-filled saloon. Rose took a deep breath, tasting freedom for the first time in months. The main street of Willow Creek was quiet now, with most folks already home for supper. A few windows glowed with warm lamplight, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. Tom's horse stood tied to the hitching post outside the saloon, a big bay mare with intelligent eyes and a glossy coat that spoke of good care. Next to her was a sturdy wagon loaded with supplies from the general store. "I was planning to head back to the ranch tonight," Tom said, adjusting his hat. "But if you ladies would prefer to stay in town, I can get you rooms at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable place, and she'll take good care of you." Rose looked at her sisters. They had nowhere to go in town, no money for rooms, and no friends who could help them. Everyone they'd known had either moved on or turned their backs when Murphy came calling with his papers and claims of debt. "What exactly are you offering us, Mr. Sullivan?" Rose asked, finding her voice at last. She had to know what he expected in return for his kindness. In her experience, men always wanted something. Tom leaned against his wagon, crossing his arms over his chest. "Well, Miss Rose, it is Rose, isn't it?" When she nodded, he continued. "My ranch is about 2 hours' ride from here. It's a big spread with plenty of room. I've got a main house where I live, and there's a smaller cabin that was built for my foreman before he moved on. It's got 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If you and your sisters want to stay there while you figure out what comes next, you're welcome to it. No strings attached. You can leave whenever you want, go wherever you think is best." Lily spoke up for the first time since leaving the saloon. "And what do you get out of it, mister? Nobody does something for nothing." Tom smiled at her directness. "You're right to ask, Miss Lily. Truth is, I could use some help around the place. The main house hasn't had a woman's touch in years, and I'm tired of eating beans and hardtack for every meal. If you wanted to help with cooking and cleaning, I'd pay fair wages for the work. But that's only if you want to. Nobody's forcing you to do anything. Rose studied his face in the dim light from the saloon windows. She'd gotten good at reading men's faces over the past few months, looking for signs of cruelty or deception, but all she saw in Tom Sullivan's eyes was honest tiredness and something that might have been loneliness. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "You don't even know us." Tom was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I reckon everyone deserves a chance to make their own choices in life," he said finally. "What happened in there tonight, that wasn't right. Nobody should be sold like cattle, no matter what debts they owe." He looked back at Rose, and she saw old pain flickering in his eyes. "Besides, I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to turn. Someone helped me once when I needed it most. Maybe it's time I passed that kindness along." Little Daisy tugged on Rose's sleeve. "Can we trust him, Rosie?" she whispered, loud enough for Tom to hear. Before Rose could answer, Tom knelt down so he was at Daisy's eye level. "That's a smart question, little miss. You should never trust a stranger just because he says nice things. But I'll tell you what. If you come with me and you don't like what you see, I'll bring you right back to town in the morning. How's that sound?" Daisy considered this seriously, her small face scrunched up in thought. "Will there be food? Real food, not just bread and water?" Tom's expression darkened for a moment as he realized what Murphy had been feeding them. "There'll be plenty of food," he promised. "Beef stew, fresh bread, apple pie, if my housekeeper's recipe book is anything to go by." Rose made her decision. They had no other options, and something about Tom Sullivan felt different from the other men they'd encountered. Maybe it was the way he'd spoken to them with respect instead of treating them like property. Maybe it was how he'd knelt down to talk to Daisy at her own level. Or maybe it was just desperation, but she was willing to take the chance. "We'll come with you," she said. "At least for tonight." Tom nodded and stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "That's all I'm asking for. One night, and then you can decide what feels right." He helped them climb into the wagon, making sure they were comfortable among the sacks of flour and sugar he'd bought at the general store. Rose noticed he gave them the warmest blanket and kept the scratchy horse blanket for himself. As the wagon rolled out of Willow Creek, Rose looked back at Murphy's saloon one last time. The broken door had been propped closed with a chair, and yellow light still spilled from the windows. She shuddered, remembering the hungry faces of the men who had bid on them like they were nothing more than goods to be bought and sold. "You cold?" Tom asked, noticing her shiver. "No, sir," Rose replied. "I was just thinking about how close we came to something terrible happening." Tom's hands tightened on the reins. "Well, you don't have to think about that anymore. You're safe now, and as long as I have anything to say about it, you'll stay that way." The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they rolled through the darkness toward an uncertain but hopeful future. For the first time in months, Rose allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. Behind them, the lights of Willow Creek faded into the distance, and ahead lay the promise of a new beginning. The sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as it rose over Sullivan Ranch the next morning. Rose woke up in a real bed for the first time in months, between clean sheets that smelled like lavender instead of smoke and whiskey. For a moment, she forgot where she was and panic shot through her chest. Then she heard Lily humming softly in the next room and remembered. They were safe. The cabin Tom had given them was simple but comfortable, with wooden floors that gleamed in the morning, light and windows that let in the fresh prairie air. Daisy was still sleeping in the smallest bedroom, curled up like a kitten under a patchwork quilt. Rose had checked on her 3 times during the night, hardly believing they were really free. Through the kitchen window, Rose could see Tom already, at work in the distance, mending a fence line with 2 other men she didn't recognize. Even from far away, she could tell he was the kind of boss who worked alongside his hands instead of just giving orders from the porch. The past 3 months had been like a nightmare, but now Rose felt like she was finally waking up. The cabin had everything they needed. A cast-iron stove that heated the whole place, shelves lined with dishes and cooking supplies, and even a small library of books in the sitting room. Tom had told them the night before that his late wife had been a great reader. Rose found herself wondering about the woman who had lived here before them. What had she been like? Had she been happy in this quiet place so far from town? The cabin still held traces of a woman's touch. Dried flowers in a blue vase, embroidered curtains at the windows, a wooden recipe box on the kitchen counter. "Morning, Rosie," Lily said, appearing in the doorway with her hair braided back and her sleeves rolled up. "I've been exploring. There's a vegetable garden behind the house that's gone wild, and the prettiest little creek running through the trees. Want to come see?" Rose smiled at the excitement in her sister's voice. It had been so long since she'd seen Lily look truly happy. "Let me get dressed first. Is Daisy awake?" "Still sleeping like the dead." Poor little thing, she was so tired. Lily's expression grew serious. "Rose, do you really think we can trust him? Tom, I mean. It all seems too good to be true." Rose had been asking herself the same question all night. "I don't know," she admitted. "But what choice do we have? We can't go back to town with no money and nowhere to live. At least here we have a roof over our heads while we figure things out." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Rose opened it to find Tom standing on the porch, his hat in his hands, and a shy smile on his weathered face. "Morning, ladies, I hope you slept well." He gestured toward a basket at his feet. "I brought you some breakfast. My cook, Old Pete, makes the best biscuits this side of Kansas City. There's bacon and eggs, too, and some fresh milk from our cow." Rose's mouth watered at the mention of real food. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan. Would you like to come in for coffee?" Tom shook his head. "I don't want to intrude. You ladies need time to settle in. But I was wondering, if you're feeling up to it, would you like me to show you around the ranch today? Help you get your bearings?" Before Rose could answer, Daisy appeared at her elbow, drawn by the smell of bacon. Her eyes went wide when she saw the feast Tom had brought them. "Is that really for us?" she asked in wonder. Tom's smile grew wider. "Every bit of it, little miss. And there's plenty more where that came from." After breakfast, the best meal they'd had in months, Tom gave them a tour of the ranch. It was bigger than Rose had imagined, with rolling hills covered in green grass as far as the eye could see. Hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, watched over by cowboys on horseback. The main house was a sprawling wooden building with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under every window. Tom had built it himself, he told them with quiet pride, adding rooms as he could afford them. It was clearly meant to hold a large family, though now it seemed too big for just one man. "My wife always said it was too much house for two people," Tom said as they walked past the empty swing on the front porch. "She had big dreams about filling it with children someday." Rose heard the sadness in his voice and didn't ask what had happened to his wife. Some sorrows were too deep for sharing with strangers, no matter how kind they seemed. They visited the barn where Tom kept his prize horses, including the gentle mare that had pulled their wagon the night before. Daisy fell in love with a spotted pony named Patches who seemed equally taken with the young girl. "She's getting old," Tom said, watching Daisy feed the pony carrots. "Too old for ranch work, but she's got plenty of spirit left for gentler pursuits." By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was high overhead and Rose felt more hopeful than she had in months. Tom had been nothing but respectful, never pressuring them to make any decisions about their future. He'd simply shown them what life could be like at Sullivan Ranch. That evening, Rose surprised herself by offering to cook dinner for Tom as a way of saying thank you. She used ingredients from his well-stocked pantry to make a beef stew that filled the cabin with rich, savory smells. Lily helped by setting the table with the good china they found in the cabinet, while Daisy picked wildflowers for a centerpiece. When Tom arrived at the appointed time, his hair was still damp from washing, and he'd put on a clean shirt. He looked almost nervous as he stood in the doorway, as if he wasn't sure he was really welcome. "Something smells mighty good in here," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Rose is the best cook in 3 counties, Lily announced proudly. Ma taught her everything she knew before she died. Over dinner, they talked about simple things, the weather, the cattle, the small-town gossip from Willow Creek. Tom was a good listener, asking questions about their lives before Murphy's Saloon without pushing for details they weren't ready to share. Rose found herself studying his face as he talked about his plans for expanding the ranch. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter, but also deeper creases that came from worry and loss. His hands were scarred from years of hard work, but gentle when he helped Daisy cut her meat. After dinner, Tom insisted on helping with the dishes despite Rose's protests. As they worked side by side at the kitchen sink, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Not just the absence of fear, but actual contentment. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as she dried the last plate, "I want you to know how grateful we are for everything you've done. We'll work hard to earn our keep here." Tom was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You don't owe me anything, Rose. But if you want to stay, if this place feels like it could be home, then I'd be honored to have you here." Rose looked around the cozy cabin, at Lily reading a book by the firelight and Daisy already nodding off in her chair. For the first time since their father died, she could imagine a future that didn't include fear or hunger or shame. "I think," she said softly, "that we'd like to stay." Tom's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then welcome home," he said simply. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, but inside the cabin, three sisters had finally found the safety and belonging they'd been searching for all along. 2 years had passed since that terrible night at Murphy's Saloon, and Sullivan Ranch had become everything the three sisters had never dared to dream of: a real home. The small cabin where they'd first stayed had been expanded with Tom's help, adding a proper dining room and a study where Rose kept the ranch's books. She'd discovered she had a natural head for numbers, and Tom had gratefully turned over the complicated business of managing accounts and correspondence to her capable hands. The ranch itself had grown too. What started as a successful cattle operation had become one of the most respected spreads in the territory. Tom's reputation for fair dealing and honest work had spread, and neighbors often came to him for advice on everything from breeding stock to water rights. Rose stood at the kitchen window of the main house watching Tom work with a new group of horses in the corral. He moved with the same quiet confidence she'd first noticed that night he'd rescued them, but now she knew the gentle heart that beat beneath his strong exterior. Her feelings for him had grown slowly, like wildflowers blooming after a long winter, until she could no longer imagine a life without him in it. Lily burst through the kitchen door, her cheeks flushed from riding and her eyes sparkling with excitement. At 19, she'd grown into a beautiful young woman who could handle a horse as well as any cowboy on the ranch. She'd also caught the attention of Dr. Samuel Hayes, the young physician who'd recently set up practice in Willow Creek. "Rose, you'll never guess what happened in town today," Lily exclaimed, pulling off her riding gloves. "Dr. Hayes asked if he could come calling on Sunday. Properly calling with flowers and everything." Rose smiled at her sister's joy. "And what did you tell him?" I said yes, of course. "Oh, Rose, I think I'm in love, really, truly in love." Lily spun around the kitchen like a dancer, her skirts swirling around her boots. Before Rose could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, she could see a group of men riding hard toward the ranch house, dust, clouds trailing behind them. Tom had stopped his work with the horses and was walking quickly toward the main house, his face serious. The men who dismounted in the yard were strangers to Rose, but she could tell from their expensive clothes and the way they carried themselves that they weren't ordinary ranch hands or neighbors. The leader was a thin man with a sharp face and cold eyes that reminded Rose unpleasantly of a snake. Tom met them on the front porch, and Rose could hear raised voices even through the closed windows. She moved closer, trying to make out what they were saying. "This is still a legal claim, Sullivan," the snake-faced man was saying, waving a sheaf of papers in the air. "The original survey was wrong, and this land rightfully belongs to the railroad company." Rose felt her blood turn cold. She'd heard stories about railroad companies using crooked lawyers and false documents to steal land from honest ranchers. Was someone trying to take away their home just when they'd finally found peace? Tom's voice was steady but hard as steel. "I've got a clear title to this land, bought and paid for fair and square. Any survey mistakes aren't my problem. We'll see about that, the man replied with an ugly smile. You've got 30 days to clear out, or we'll have the sheriff remove you. After the men left, Tom came into the kitchen looking older than Rose had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged with the weight of worry, and there were new lines around his eyes. Tom, what's happening? Rose asked, her heart pounding with fear. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table and rubbed his face with both hands. There's a railroad company claiming they own half the ranch. They say the original survey was wrong and that the land was never legally mine to buy. But that's not true, is it? Lily asked, her earlier joy replaced by concern. I don't know, Tom admitted. The papers look official, but something about this whole thing doesn't sit right with me. I've had clear title to this land for over 15 years. If there was a problem, why are they just coming forward now? Rose sat down across from him, her mind already working. She'd spent 2 years managing the ranch's paperwork, and she knew every document related to the property. Tom, where are your original land papers, the ones from when you first bought the ranch? In the safe in my study. Why? Because if someone's trying to cheat you, there might be something in those papers that proves it. Let me look at everything. Your deed, the survey records, any correspondence about the sale. For the next 3 days, Rose pored over every document related to the ranch. She spread papers across the dining room table, comparing dates and signatures, looking for any detail that might help them fight the railroad's claim. It was Daisy who found the key piece of evidence. Now 16 and taller than Rose, she'd grown into a thoughtful young woman who helped with both the ranch work and the household accounts. She was bringing Rose a cup of coffee when she noticed something odd about one of the survey maps. Rose, look at this, she said, pointing to a faded signature in the corner of an old document. This surveyor's signature, I've seen it somewhere else. Rose looked where Daisy was pointing and felt her heart race. The signature looked familiar to her too. She quickly shuffled through the pile of railroad company papers until she found what she was looking for. A letter signed by the same man, but dated 5 years after the survey was supposedly done. Daisy, you're brilliant, Rose exclaimed. This surveyor couldn't have signed both documents. According to the county records, he died 3 years before this letter was written. Someone forged his signature on the railroad's papers. Armed with this evidence, Tom rode to the county seat to meet with a lawyer. The legal battle took weeks, but in the end, the truth came out. The railroad company had been using fake documents to steal land from ranchers across the territory. Not only did Tom get to keep his ranch, but several other families got their land back too. The victory celebration at Sullivan Ranch lasted 3 days. Neighbors came from miles around to congratulate Tom and to thank him for fighting a battle that had protected all of them. It was during this celebration that Tom finally found the courage to do something he'd been thinking about for months. On the evening of the last day of celebration, as the sun was setting and the last guests were heading home, Tom asked Rose to take a walk with him. They strolled down to the creek that ran through the ranch, the same creek where Lily had played on their first day there. Rose, Tom said, stopping beside the old oak tree where they'd hung a swing for Daisy. I've got something I need to tell you. Rose's heart began to beat faster. She'd seen the way Tom had been looking at her lately, and she'd caught him watching her with an expression she dared not name. These past 2 years, Tom continued, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. You and your sisters have brought life back to this place. More than that, you've brought life back to me. I thought I'd lost the chance for happiness when my first wife died, but you've shown me that the heart can heal and love again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Rose, I know I'm older than you, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being here. Would you consider becoming my wife? Rose felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the simple gold ring in the box. Oh, Tom. Yes, of course I'll marry you. Their wedding took place the following spring with half the territory in attendance. Lily served as maid of honor, beautiful in a dress of blue silk that matched her eyes. Daisy walked down the aisle, scattering flower petals, her face glowing with happiness for her sister. Dr. Hayes had indeed come calling, and he and Lily were married the following year in a ceremony that was smaller but no less joyful. Daisy surprised everyone by announcing her intention to become a teacher, and Tom happily paid for her schooling in the territorial capital. As the years passed, Sullivan Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where those in need could find help. Rose and Tom took in orphaned children, helped struggling families get back on their feet, and always had room at their table for anyone who needed a meal. They had 4 children of their own, 2 boys and 2 girls who grew up knowing that family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing to love and care for each other. The ranch prospered under their joint management, but more importantly, it became a beacon of hope in an often harsh and unforgiving land. Rose never forgot that terrible night in Murphy's Saloon when their lives had seemed hopeless. But now, watching her children play in the same yard where she'd once feared for her future, she understood that sometimes the darkest moments come just before the most beautiful dawn. Love had found them when they least expected it, and it had transformed not just their lives but the lives of everyone they touched.